So one of the things we learned in our preaching class that we did in the spring was that when you're looking at interpreting the Gospels, you have to figure out why they chose this story. Because Luke had all kinds of things that he could have told us about Jesus, the Messiah, but of all the things that he learned in his historical research, this is what he chose to give us. And so I look at the passage today and I'm like, it fits perfectly. When you think about to whom he's writing to Theophilus, potentially a God-fearer, which is a Gentile who is being taught by Jewish rabbis because he's interested in understanding more about Yahweh. And it would make sense that when he does that, that he would include a genealogy that traces it all the way back to Adam. Because Theophilus would have understood that, the rabbis would have taught him about this incredible promise that was given all the way back in the beginning of Genesis that culminates, at least initially, in what we saw earlier in Luke at the birth of Jesus Christ. It's probably a story he would have known. This redemption of the seed, the redemption of the servant of the Old Testament, of Messiah, the Prince. Now, I have to admit, I love history, I love genealogies. My mom was really big. Matter of fact, the last thing she gave me before she passed was like 20 boxes of all the research that she had done on the Daring family, which is my mom's side of the family. I haven't even touched those boxes. She used to always tell me like I was related to this person or this king, which may or may not be true. But I do love them. But most people, when they look at the biblical genealogies, Bruce and I were just talking about, like, they skip over them. Like, who wants to read all of those names anyway? And why are they important that we need to know them? Kind of boring. Think about 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. In 1 Chronicles chapters 1 through 9, it's just a list of genealogies. So most people, when they read Chronicles, start with chapter 10. And yet they miss an incredible part of the theology that is often embedded in these genealogies. As a matter of fact, in 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 2, in the middle of his genealogy about Reuben, who was Jacob, if you remember the Old Testament, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jacob's firstborn, he says, although Judah prevailed, and Judah became the one through whom would be the Nagid, the prince. And so we're going to look a little bit at that today. The prince David was called the Nagid. Messiah the prince is called the Nagid in that incredible prophecy in Daniel chapter 9. So here we have Judah, the one through whom the Nagid, the Messiah, would come. In the middle of a genealogy about Reuben. That's genealogies. But when we look at Old Testament and New Testament genealogies, there's a couple of things we have to keep in mind that's very different from our Western mindset. First of all, genealogies were never complete. So if you look at my genealogy, like you would look at from all those boxes in my basement right now, you would trace it all the way back to this guy, Deringer, who came over, all the way down, and you would list all the cousins and nephews and uncles. That's not how it plays in the Old Testament and the New Testament. You could skip over multiple generations and still say son of. They didn't have words for grandfather or grandson. So you think about it. My oldest son is named Matthew. I'm Michael. My dad's name was Joel, and his dad's name was David. And so that was four genealogies. In a genealogy, you would list all four. If we were writing Old Testament and I was insignificant and my dad was insignificant, you would say Matthew, son of David. Perfectly okay. And that's why sometimes when you compare genealogies, it doesn't fit because everybody had their own style. And oftentimes they would be written, and the style that they were written was to fit the theology of the passage. And so we're going to look a little bit at that today. But there's kind of a cool thing. If you can skip multiple generations today, you know that crazy uncle that you have? You just write him out of the genealogy. He never existed. Like, how cool would that be if we could still do that? Not a bad idea. The other thing, too, is they're stylistic, that they were written with, again, to think of the theology of the passage. So you always have to keep that in mind. So we're going to see that in the book of Genesis today. We see that in the book of Matthew. Remember in Matthew you have 14 generations from David to Abraham, or from Abraham to David, David to the deportation to Messiah. That's stylistic. When you compare it with other genealogies, there's names missing. That's okay. And by the way, the number 14 is actually, if you look at it in the Hebrew words, is actually the word David, which is David. That fits. So those are genealogies. And I brought one of my favorite reading books of all time, because I told you I love genealogies, down through the Staffelbein years. This is a history of my family, all the way back to a guy by the name of George Michael Stapelbein, who was born in 1657, died in 1723, and came to America. And so I am a distant relative of this guy. And in that, I also find that I'm a distant relative of Daniel Boone. How cool is that? Which would probably explain not the coonskin cap, but that I love the outdoors, I love hunting, possibly. But that's genealogy. So they can great insight and times. I don't know about your genealogy. I don't know about mine. Great disappointment as well. So the sermon today really has two parts. We have the beginning part of the sermon, which is, and I've titled it, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. That'll make sense when we get to the end. It starts with the baptism of Jesus by John in chapter 3, verses 21 through 22. And then we're going to get into the genealogy. So in chapter 3, verses 21 through 22, now it came about when all the people were baptized that Jesus also was baptized. And while he was praying, that is Jesus, to God, heaven was opened. So you have in this first section of this narrative, you have all the people, these are the people from verse 18 of the chapter, that were all coming out to be baptized and hear the message of John. And what Luke does, and this is great theology, he puts Jesus in the midst of that crowd. He is just one of the crowd coming out to be baptized by John. And it fits what the theology of what Luke's trying to explain in this is that Jesus is one of us and yet totally distinct from us. But at this point, he's just part of the crowd coming out like everyone else to be baptized. And it says, and Jesus also was baptized. And again, this is Luke in his gospel pays less attention to this story than the other gospel writers. But again, to show Theophilus that Jesus identified himself with humanity, he writes it this way. So he comes out to be baptized, and what he's going to do is to make sure that we understand that he's going to give us a genealogy that traces Jesus back through human people all the way to Adam, who he's going to designate as Son of God. So he's going to be one of us and yet Son of God. And while he was praying, heaven was opened. So what we have here is what Bruce was talking about last week with John. We have Jesus' prophetic call. So this is his call to ministry. And we have examples of this in the Old Testament. Theophilus would have understood this from his studies of the Old Testament scripture, that Jesus is now being received as a prophet and being commissioned by God as a prophet. The Hebrew word navi, which is prophet, literally just means someone who speaks for someone else. And so Jesus is now going to be the spokesman for God. He is now the prophet. And so with this prophetic call of Jesus, and like the prophets of old, they're often represented by their name and then the name of their father. And here Luke's going to go a bit further. He's going to trace Joseph all the way back to the father Abraham. And the root idea that they speak for God. We have Isaiah, son of Amos, Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, Ezekiel, son of Buzi, and we have Jesus, the supposed son of Joseph. And so in verse 22, he goes on, and the Holy Spirit descended upon him in bodily form like a dove. The key word is upon him. Again, that comes from Old Testament scriptures, that was a representative call of a prophet, that the Spirit of God was filling this person to prepare them for the ministry to which they were called. all the way back when they built the doors of the tabernacle. Those men, the Spirit of the Lord was upon them to carve the doors, because you can't have idiot marks on the tabernacle doors, right? Like, oh yeah, we got to erase that out. Like, it had to be done perfect, and the Spirit of God empowers them to complete the mission that they were given. So again, part of this prophetic call of Jesus. It's interesting because part of, like, a lot of ink has been spilled about this idea of the dove. So this descended upon him, prophetic call, like a dove. Notice he says like a dove, not a dove. And people have said, well, what does that dove represent? That's not what he said. He didn't say dove. He said it was like a dove. And so in keeping with those passages of the Old Testament, one of which he's going to read aloud in the Nazareth synagogue in the next chapter is from Isaiah 61:1, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. That same reference, and I've been called to do, and he goes through his reference as a Messiah, like, bring sight to the blind and all of that. And so this what he sees and what the people around him, and I presume that Luke interviewed people who had witnessed this event, what they saw was something come from heaven and descend upon Jesus, something that was physical manifestation of the Spirit of God. So it was no doubt that the Spirit of God had filled Messiah, filled Jesus to commission him for his service. And again, we're not sure what it was, but it doesn't matter, because the point was the Spirit of God, not the dove. And in that point, a voice came from heaven, "Thou art my beloved Son, in thee I am well pleased." And much like in Old Testament texts, when God speaks to commission people, he speaks directly from heaven. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And it's interesting that Luke would trace that genealogy the way he does, because what he's trying to indicate, as I said already, is that Jesus is one of us. He is humanity, but he is also the Son of the living God. And he's going to trace it through this lineage, but he's going to start out by making sure we understand that God himself proclaims that from the heavens, "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased." But then you also have the human genealogies back to the first human, Adam, who was called by Luke the Son of God. So, Son of God, Son of Man. Again, a fulfillment of Isaiah 42. "Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom my soul delights. I have put my Spirit upon him." So the second part of that is Jesus, the Son of God, the promised seed of old. And so when he began his ministry, verse 23, Jesus himself was about 30 years old. Luke is just letting us know that that was the common age when people would begin ministering for God. And so he's 30 years old. He's fulfilling his ministry that God has given to him, being supposedly the son of Joseph, son of Eli. So the genealogy here points back to the fact that Jesus is indeed the Son of God through both conception, which we saw already, and through humanity, Son of God. And notice what he does. He says that supposedly the son of Joseph. He uses that word just prior in chapter 2. So remember when they were returning from Jerusalem? And when they were returning from Jerusalem, they supposed that Jesus was with the rest of the crowd. And in reality, he was back in Jerusalem. Same word that he uses here. So from a human perspective, everyone assumed that Jesus was the son of Joseph. But he uses that term to let you know, and to let us know, and to let Theophilus know that's not real. He is truly the Son of God. But from a human perspective, everyone considered that he was the Son. Again, we're going to see that in the Nazareth episode coming up, where they say, "Is this not Joseph's son? Like, why is he doing this? Why is he saying these things?" Because that was the presumption, not that he was the Son of God. So now for the genealogy of Jesus, Son of God. So rather than awkwardly reading these names to you, I thought about it. Bruce asked me about it. I want to take on this passage. We're not going to try to compare Luke's genealogy with Matthew's genealogy. Frankly, that would be boring. I love that kind of stuff. Don't get me wrong, and I've done that. But like for a Sunday morning, probably not going to play. And we're not going to look and compare the genealogy of Chronicles and Matthew and Luke and Genesis. That's just way beyond the scope of a Sunday morning. Or whether he used the Hebrew text or the Greek Septuagint, or whether Luke had access to the actual genealogy of Joseph, or from Joseph's family. That could be as well. But what I want to do, these are great questions. Love to answer those in a different setting. What I want to do is I want to work backwards from the genealogy. And I want to trace the promise of the seed that started with Adam and ends with the first Christmas, but that's not the end. But we're going to start there and then look at another coming. But we're going to start with Adam. But to do that, we have to understand one Hebrew word. I've already given you a couple, but this is the one you got to remember. Zerah. Zerah means seed. And the beauty of that, I'm a gardener. I love gardening, love growing my own tomatoes. Best tomato, Honest Nore, no doubt. Look it up, it's the best. But like you take, if I were to have those seed in front of me and I were to pour them into my hand and say, look at my tomato seed, that would be perfectly legitimate and it would be a bunch of seed. But if I were to take one of those and show you that seed and say, look at my tomato seed, both of those are correct. That's the beauty of the word seed in the Old Testament as well. It is a collective noun. It can refer to a multiplicity and to a singular. And so we're going to see that immediately in the text that we're going to look at. So keep that in mind. The problem with looking at the word zerah or seed and looking at that into our English translations is they translate it differently. Sometimes it's boy, sometimes it's offspring, sometimes it's child. And so it's hard to trace it through our English text, a little easier to trace it through the Hebrew text, to try to really find that continuity of this promise that was given at the beginning of time that culminates, that we saw in chapter 2 at the birth of Christ, and yet still to culminate into the future. So we're going to start, and I didn't give you the text on this. You can look these up in your scripts. There was too many texts to play with. But Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 through 24, the serpent's curse, and 3 perfect states reduced to chaos. So in Genesis chapter 3, you know what happens in the Garden of Eden, the tree of knowledge and good and evil and all of that. You know what happens. And so what God does is he reduces 3 things that were perfect, that were, to use the word peace, that is, they were whole, to chaos. The first is, if you look at verse 16, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. This is chapter 3 of Genesis. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Now, there's only 2 people in existence at this point, and what he's trying to say is what used to be this perfect union is now a dog-eat-dog relationship. So there's this chaos that came into human relationships. The second one is creation itself. If you remember, as you read on, that in chapter 3, verse 17, cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. You'll do it till you die, and you return to dust. So creation itself turns against man. So what was in the garden was perfect. Again, they had to work. They were told to work and serve the garden. It's not like work was invented at this point, but work became part of the curse. That now creation itself would be against mankind. And the third one is, as you know, mankind is kicked out of the garden. So God, he is denied access to the temple of God, because that's what Eden was. Eden was a temple of Yahweh. And God dwelt there, and they walked together, and they had fellowship. And so what we have is this chaos of unblemished access to God. So these 3 chaoses are parts of what happens and what is going to play into our narrative today. But in the midst of this, there's a curse on the serpent. And this is the beautiful call, the first call of what we know as the promise of redemption. So right after that, the first thing he does is he curses the serpent and gives a blessing to humanity. So you have to understand, I grew up in Wenatchee, at the First Baptist Church in Wenatchee, and I was taught that snakes used to have legs, and after this, the legs fell off, and now they're on their stomachs all the rest of your life. That is not true. Just to let you know, the serpent here is Satan himself. This is Satan the deceiver in the garden. And you say, how can that possibly be in a place of perfection? Talk to me. That's a whole different theological plane on that one. But this is the serpent talking to the woman. This is Satan himself. And because of what he does, God first curses Satan, and he says, cursed are you, because you have done this, more than all the cattle, more than every beast of the field, on your belly you shall go, dust you shall eat all the days of your life, and I will put enmity. Keep it right there. So what he says is there's going to come a time when the serpent is going to be face down in the dust. Now, again, I know snakes, Colin. I grew up in eastern Washington, saw lots of snakes. But what this is ancient Near Eastern warfare. So when you defeated a king in the ancient Near East, he would lay at your feet, face down, and you would put your foot on his head, and that was representative that you have conquered that king. That's what's playing here. What he has said is the serpent will be conquered. And the beauty is he tells us how in the next. But the enmity is going to exist. And I will put enmity between your seed and her seed. So there's going to be this hostility. There's going to be this angst, this anger between the seed of Satan and the seed of the woman. And between your seed and her seed. And notice what he does. He then goes to the third masculine singular. He will crush you or bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise or crush him on the heel. The he is the seed. That's the promise. This seed of the woman, a third masculine singular, because remember, this word seed can refer to a multiplicity or it can refer to a singular. So of all the seed of the woman who's going to come, there will come a seed, and that seed will crush the head of the serpent. Now again, I used to, when I was teaching this in seminary, I would say you get two choices. I crush your head or I crush your heel. Which do you want? Like one is fatal, one is not. So in crushing the serpent's head, there will be a non-fatal wound to the seed. That's all we know at this point. That's all Adam and Eve know. And yet at the very beginning of chapter 4, verse 1 of the book of Genesis, now the man had relations with his wife, Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, and she said, I've begotten a man-child. Now, some of your texts may say in italics, with the help of. The word that's used there can be that, but it can also be a sign of the direct object. And I take it as such. I believe when Eve gave birth to Cain, that she believed that this is the one. This is the seed. I've begotten a man-child, ... Yahweh. Now, Cain kind of shows he's not the one, right? Like Cain kills his brother. And what the writer does, what Moses skillfully does, is he gives us the first example of this enmity. The seed of Satan is all the people who exist who will be in hostility towards God, hostility to the things of God, and the seed of the woman will be the righteous ones who will eventually bring forth Messiah into the world. Incredible theology. As a matter of fact, when you go into chapter 4 and you continue down, you get the line of Cain, the line of the ones who are against God. And he lists name after name after name after name. The one I want you to keep in the back pocket is he gets to a guy by the name of Lamech. So this is where I told you they're stylistic. I'll show you another Lamech coming up. But in this story, all we know is that we get to the end of that Cainite line in the genealogy of those who are in antithesis to God, and you get a guy by the name of Lamech. And this is what he says in chapter 4, verse 23. We'll do it, yeah. And Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech. 2 wives should already give you an indication something's not right. Give heed to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. Lamech is basically taunting God. And like, if you gave Cain what he gave, bring it on, God. Give me the best you can do, not worried about it. That's the line of Satan. Antithesis towards God. That's enmity, hostility towards the things of God. So then we get to Adam, son of God. That's at the end of our text today in verse 38. That's where he ends his genealogy. We're working backwards. Adam, son of God. In chapter 5, verses 1 through 3, this is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female, and he blessed them and named them Adam, man, in the day when they were created. And when he had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness and his image, and named him Seth. Now, what is a little subtle here, but the fact that God named Adam, and made him in the likeness and of himself, and then Seth is born to Adam in the likeness of Adam. What he says is exactly what Luke is trying to get across in this passage. He is the Son of God. God made him. So Adam himself, although humanity, is the Son of God, because God named him and made him in his own likeness, and he passes that on to his next son, Seth. And what, again, I told you they were stylistic. What the writer does in chapter 5 is that he gives us the age of the patriarch when the seed is born, and then they're going to have other sons and daughters, and he lives so many years, and then he dies. But notice it's always death, because the writer wants you to understand that was the curse from Adam as well, that you will die. So when you read the one in verse 4, then all the days of Adam after he became the father of Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. So the age when he gives birth to the seed, and then all the other years that he's going to live. But to understand Seth and Adam, we have to go back to the end of chapter 4, verse 25. And Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son. And she named him Seth, or Sheth, for she said, God has appointed, the Hebrew word is set, or shet, just like Seth. God has appointed me another, I don't know what your text says, the word is Zerah. He's given me another seed to replace Adam, or to replace Abel. Abel was the seed. And in that enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of woman, the seed is killed. And God raises up Seth to replace Abel. Another seed. And then you have this genealogy that goes through. So you have Seth, son of Adam. Seth was appointed by God. Same Hebrew root word. You have Enosh, son of Seth. In chapter 4, verse 26, same thing. So Enosh is born of Seth. And what you have is, and he said, and that day men began to call on the name of the Lord. And the word Enosh can either be weak or frail. It can be another word for man. But the point is, potentially their spiritual weakness causes them, empowers them through the Spirit of God to call on the name of the Lord. That word is used again in the book of Genesis when Abraham builds the altar at Bethel and offers a sacrifice and calls on the name of the Lord. So we have here the ungodly line that ends in the guy by the name of Lamech, and then we have the godly line that begins with Adam and Seth and Enosh, and they are the ones who call on the name of the Lord. They are the righteous ones. And remember the Lamech that said, God, give me everything you've got, because I can take it, like that hostility towards God. Stylistic genealogy. Moses ends this one in another guy by the name of Lamech. But this guy's a little bit different. He is Lamech, son of Methuselah. So looking at chapter 5, verses 28 and 29, and Lamech lived 182 years and became the father of a son. Now he called his name Noah, saying, "This one shall give us rest from the work of our work and the toil of our hands arising from the ground which the Lord had cursed." So Lamech, arrogant towards God. Another Lamech, stylistic, same, this is the genealogy of the good guys, goes to a guy by the name of Lamech, and notice what he says. He says, I'm going to name my son. The only time that the writer in this genealogy tells us why they gave the name, he's like, I'm going to name my son Noah, which means rest, because maybe he will give us rest from our toil. Remember the second chaos, the toil of the ground? What Lamech is expressing here is he's hoping Noah is the one. He's hoping Noah is the seed. And maybe this is the one. So each one of them, when they would give birth to this seed, they were anticipatory that maybe this is the one, that this is the Messiah. This is the Yahweh, the man and Yahweh coming together to save us from the curse of the fall. Unfortunately, things don't go that way. As a matter of fact, the enmity, Satan and his seed overwhelmed the world with evil, to the point that God has to destroy man from the face of the earth. As a matter of fact, when you read the text of Genesis, there is only one righteous guy that's named, and that's Noah. And interesting, when he says that he's going to name his name Noah, and maybe he will give us rest, that's the same word in chapter 6, verse 6, when God says that I don't like these people anymore, and that I'm going to destroy them. Same word. That he was sorry that he had made man. And so we know what happens. The flood comes, things are destroyed, and all of that. And again, we could play with that. That's not the point. All we know is when that genealogy ends, all we know is Noah has 3 sons. And our question is what? Which one's the seed? Like, which one is the one through whom Messiah would come? So we go to chapter 9 of the text. Chapter 9, verse 25. We're going to start with verse 20. So they come off the ark. They move down out of wherever the ark rested into the plains of Shinar or whatever. And Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. And he drank of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. Now, I'm not going to explain what I think that means. All I'm telling you is sin continued after the flood. That's part of what we're to understand from that. That mankind still needed, after destroying everything, mankind still had sin as a part of his nature. And the 2 brothers, remember, the one brother goes in, the other brothers face backwards so that they don't see their father's nakedness. But we get to the part, because remember, our question is, which one is the seed? Which one is the one through whom the Messiah is going to come? So we get to verse 26 of chapter 9. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan," because Canaan was the son of the one who went and looked on Noah's nakedness. "A servant of servants he shall be to his brothers," which a bit is a polemic, because remember, the people of Israel are going to go into the land of Canaan and destroy the Canaanites. A little bit Genesis gives us a clue to why God would do that. He also said, "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." Now, verse 27 is the key one. "And may God enlarge Japheth, and let him," and so the question is, what's the referent for that pronoun? Is it Japheth or God? I go back to the subject, which is God, "and let him," God, "dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be a servant." Notice he said Canaan being a servant tons of times. But let him be a servant. But let God dwell in the tents of Shem. The word Shem is Sem, right? Hebrew letter is same thing. So the Shemites are the Semites, through whom we get Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the way down through the history of Israel. And so to dwell in the tent, remember the tabernacle, and later on the temple, that's where God would dwell. So of those sons of Shem, as you look at that, you have Abraham, son of Terah. And remember, Abraham was the one who was called out of Haran, out of Ur, and he comes to Canaan. And God gives him this incredible promise. And what it is a covenant treaty that he makes with Abraham that was well known at that time. The key thing is it was an unconditional covenant. It did not require anything on Abraham's part for these three things to take place. There would be a land, there would be a seed, and there would be a blessing. And the land was just where God was going to dwell. That was what was most important. We see that in chapter 12. Interesting, the people of Babal, when they try to build the ziggurat on the Mesopotamian plains, they say, we want to make a name for ourselves. And God tells Abraham, I'm going to make your name great. And so we don't know the people who built the ziggurat on the plains of Shinar from chapter 11, the Tower of Babal, but we all know the name of Abraham. And God did make his name great and established a covenant relationship with him, unconditional. If you want to read about that in chapter 12, that through Abraham, all the nations of the world would be blessed. That's the promise of the seed who's going to come. And the land where God would dwell. And the blessing would be salvation. That's the promise, unconditional, made to Abraham. And so we know what happens. God tells Abraham, you're going to have a seed. You look to the stars, Abraham. If you can count the stars, that's how many seeds you're going to have. But then he keeps saying, but you're going to have a seed, singular. And Abraham says, yeah, but Sarah's too old. I tried it with Eliezer. This isn't going to play. I tried it with Hagar. God said, that's not it. He says, no, you and Sarah are going to have a child, a zerah, a seed. And so Isaac comes along. When miraculous intervention of God, that Isaac is born. So we have Isaac, son of Abraham, in chapter 22, verse 5. And so you know the story. God gives him that seed, and then God says, oh, by the way, I want you to sacrifice your son to me on an altar. Man. And Abraham gets a donkey, gets his servant, gets Isaac, and they go to a place, and it's called Moriah. The only other place that we know from that is from Chronicles, where Solomon built the temple. That's imperative to what's going on here. So Abraham takes Isaac, and he says, okay, and he says to his servants in chapter 22, verse 5, and Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go yonder, and not I will return, but we will return. I don't know what Abraham believed was going to happen. The writer of Hebrews says he thought he would raise him from the dead. Whatever the case, he believed that he and Isaac were coming back. He believed Isaac was the Messiah. That was the seed. And he believed that indeed he would come back. And so, I mean, again, credible theology. These guys knew this promise. And so he believed Isaac was the one who would come. Now, Isaac was not. And it would continue on. Isaac, gives birth to Jacob and Esau. You remember that story? We learn in that God chooses whomever he chooses. So he chooses the younger son, Jacob, who then had 12 sons. So our question in trying to trace this is, which of the 12 is going to be the one through whom the seed is going to come? And when you look at that story, in the midst of the 12th dynasty of Egypt, which is the story of Joseph, an incredible, Sesostris III, incredible theology. Joseph rises to power, saves Egypt, saves Canaan, but in the midst of that story is the story of Judah. Judah's the one who tells his brothers, let's not just kill Joseph. I got an idea. Let's sell him and make money off the deal, and then we're rich. We tell daddy's dead. We're good. That's Judah at the beginning. And you're like, that does not sound like a good guy. And so you have the story of him and Tamar, which you read chapter 38. That doesn't sound like a good guy. But something happens, and the writer never tells us. All we know is that somewhere along the way, Judah is redeemed. Because later on, when he stands before Joseph in Egypt, and Joseph says, hey, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to trick the guys. I sent Benjamin, who was the other son, the true brother of Joseph. Joseph and Benjamin were both sons of Rachel. And so he wanted to test the brothers. So he brings Benjamin back and says, Benjamin is going to be my servant, because remember, he puts money in his sack, the divination cup in his sack. And who stands up ready to give his life for Benjamin? It's Judah. Judah says, you take me instead. I promised my dad that I would bring him back. Take me instead. The sacrifice. He had no idea what that, because he had no idea that was Joseph at this point. He had no idea what this person was going to do, and probably assumed that he would spend the rest of his life in prison or die. And yet he's willing to give up his life. And so we question, like, which one is the Messiah? Which one of these is the story? Because we have Reuben. Reuben kind of messes up. If you read that story, Reuben disqualifies himself by doing something naughty. You can read about that. Simeon and Levi also do something naughty. They disqualified. So son 1, son 2, son 3 out of the picture. But then we have this incredible promise to Judah in chapter 44 of the book of Genesis. 49. So he starts, Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on your neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He crouches, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who dares raise him up? Here's where the promise is. The scepter, the piece of ruling authority, the scepter of the crown, shall not depart from Judah, and for the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes. Now, we don't know what Shiloh is. There is no Shiloh. I mean, there was a city of Shiloh, but that makes no sense. What this is a Hebrew phrase, Shelohe, until the one comes to whom it is. So this is a promise that the line of Judah would continue until the one comes to whom the true scepters, the true ruler's staff would come. That's Messiah. So through Judah would be the Messiah. And so we know that. We trace that all the way to David. And in 2 Samuel chapter 7, David is given a renewal of the Abrahamic covenant. And David, in 2 Samuel, when David hears this, 2 Samuel chapter 7, so David is given the promise that was given to Abraham. I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to give you seed. I'm going to build you a house. Because remember, David wanted to build the temple. And God's like, yeah, no, you've killed too many people, a lot of blood on your hands. So I'm going to build you a house instead. That's the dynasty. And David heard that promise that was given to Abraham. And David says something like this. Then David the king went in and sat before the Lord. And he said, who am I, O Lord God? And what is my house that you have brought me this far? And yet this was insignificant in your sight, O Lord God, for thou hast spoken also of the house of thy servant concerning the distant future. And this is the custom of man? Which makes zero sense. My interpretation of that, which is a bit Slavish, is I can't believe it's me. That's what he's saying. He understood that God was said that through you, David, would not only come a son, a seed, but through a multitude of your seed would come the one. Because notice David said, you're speaking to me of future generations. I can't believe it's me. Yet that same David sins with Bathsheba and murders her husband. Enmity, right? What's going to happen to the seed of David? What will become of the line? Who orchestrated Bathsheba to take a bath on top of her roof? Why was David not out fighting the enemies like he should have been? Was it the enemy? Was it either one of those? But enmity again enters the picture. Yet God, in his ironic mercy, chooses the latter son of David and Bathsheba, Solomon, to be the seed. That had to have been weird for Satan, that the seed of this relationship would be a next in line for the seed. He's called beloved of Yahweh. Nathan names him Jedediah, chosen of God. David's sin, although forgiven, the consequences continue. He loses his family. And we know the history of the northern and southern kingdom. The northern kingdom's taken into captivity by Assyria. the southern kingdom of Judah is slowly decimated. 605, 598, 586. And in 586, Nebuchadnezzar comes and levels the city, burns the city, destroys and burns the temple. But the very last notation in the book of 2 Kings, after the death of the last sitting son of David on the throne, Zedekiah, who was killed by Nebuchadnezzar, is that Jehoiachin, the son of David, who was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar in 598 BC, is released from captivity and by Nebuchadnezzar's successor, and lives comfortably in the Babylonian palace for the rest of his days. From him would come, according to the book of Chronicles, Zerubbabel, the now governor of the new Persian province after the people, that is the remnant of Israel who come back from captivity in 539, have returned from Babylon. Interestingly, Zerubbabel's name, seed of Babel, seed of Babylon. Like he is the seed, he's back. The seed was not destroyed. Again, Nebuchadnezzar destroys, burns the place to the ground. The seed continues. Even when it looked like Zedekiah was the last and gone, Jehoiachin, who was taken captive in the second invasion, still lives and lives comfortably for the rest of his life. You can read much about him and the rebuilding of the temple and worship in the new province of Judah and Haggai and Zechariah. But the Davidic and Messianic line continues. But as we move from Old Testament history, the province of Judah moves from Persia to the Greeks under Alexander, to the Greeks, to the Romans, where Jerusalem is nothing more than an insignificant spot in the great Roman Empire. All the way to modern history of the nation of Israel. Where is the king of Israel? Where is the promise of the land? So we're back to Jesus, the supposed son of Joseph. One thing to keep in mind is that the prophets of the Old Testament foresaw two comings. They wrote about two Christmases. The one we've seen, the coming of Jesus at Bethlehem. We've looked at that. But the prophet Isaiah, who also prophesied the name of Cyrus, who would be the one to release the people from captivity in Persia, prophesied his name 200 years before Cyrus existed. This same Isaiah, in chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, then the shoot, much like the song we sang at the beginning, then the shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from the roots will bear fruit, and the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge, the fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not make a decision by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he will judge the poor and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth. He will smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. That's the second Christmas. Now, the writers struggled with that because you have him coming as a babe, you have him coming and dying, and you have him coming as a king. The people of the New Testament, in that beginning part, the people of Israel struggled with that. Remember, they wanted a king, and they got a child who was going to die on the cross. It may look like Israel's cut off, but from the rootstock of Jesse will spring a shoot. From something that looks dead, the shoot will establish his kingdom. The line of David will be complete, and he will come. The kingdom in the Old Testament is often described in garden-like metaphors. The chaos of the fall will be fully and finally defeated and realized. And we will live in a kingdom, we will live in Eden for eternity, for those who are true seeds of Abraham. The serpent's head will be crushed, and peace will ensue. Just when it looks like the seed of the serpent is winning, much like at the cross of Jesus, the second Christmas will come. We, like the remnant of old, feel like evil and enmity is in control, do we not? As Christians, we are the seed of Abraham. We are the multiplicity of seeds who participate in the new covenant, which is the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant. Yet Christmas is coming. The root of Jesse, the distant scion of David, is coming again, this time not as an infant, but as a king. And the kingdom that is coming will be an everlasting kingdom. Chaos will turn to peace. I'm going to ask you a simple question. It's on everyone's lip this time of year. Are you ready for Christmas? I'm not talking about December 25th, the presents or lights or tinsels or Santa, but the second Christmas that is still coming, that can occur at any time. Are you ready? Are you a true seed of Abraham waiting for the final return of the seed to eliminate the brokenness of humanity? Do you long for peace? Do you long for Eden? I'm going to be square, I do. As the older I get, the more I long for that. For that day will truly be a peace among men with whom he is well pleased. Isaac Watts understood this perfectly when in 1719, after meditating on Psalm 98, he wrote this Christmas song, which we sing all the time. And we sing it at the time of the first Christmas, but it was really written about the second Christmas. Joy to the world. Lord has come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room, and heaven and nature sing. Joy to the world, the Savior reigns. Let men their songs employ, while fields and floods, rocks, hills, and plains repeat the sounding joy. No more let sin and sorrows grow, nor thorns infest the ground. He comes to make his blessings flow, far as the curse is found. He rules the world with truth and grace and makes the nations prove the glories of his righteousness and the wonders of his love. Father, we thank you that you are a great God and that through all of history, you were preparing for what we celebrate in a few weeks, but really preparing for that kingdom that is coming when all people who love you and worship you and are part of the seed of Abraham will get to live with you in the kingdom for all eternity, Father. We look forward to that. We look forward to evil being squashed. We look forward to the serpent, ultimately the head being crushed, Father. But in all of that, I pray that we will seek our own hearts to make sure we are ready for that second Christmas. Lord, give us insight and understanding so that we will be ready for when that comes. Again, we thank everything in your blessed name. Amen.